Hi, welcome everyone to today's Nature Seminar, which is the last of an incredible year that we've had of seminars of this academic year. And we're currently planning a really full and exciting schedule starting from September. So if any of you have ideas of people that you know in Western Europe or passing through Western Europe that you'd love to see here talking on any theme of nature in the tropics or else, or in Euro UK or elsewhere, that's relevant and exciting, then feel free to get in touch with your suggestions. And for today's speaker, and for which you've got a really healthy and impressive audience, so thank you for coming so late in the academic year. I'll pass on to EJ to introduce. You go front of the camera there.
It's a great honour to have Glyn Davies here today. I'm very grateful that he came and that he's still standing despite the jazz club. I first came across Glyn in the early 2000s when we were both working on bushmeat, and Glyn had been working on bushmeat for some time, and I was a newbie on the topic. And Glyn was the most exciting researcher in bushmeat at the time, and he in particular started an interdisciplinary collaboration with David Brown, who worked for the Overseas Development Institute. And it was really the first time that people had started thinking about people and bushmeat and people and wildlife, and how important it was to think about poverty in the context of bushmeat. And Glyn and David produced a really good book on this topic, bushmeat and livelihoods, which I think was a real groundbreaker. So that was my first interaction. And then Glyn was the Conservation Science Director at ZSL, where he led a big program of conservation, research-based conservation out in the real world. And again, was kind of groundbreaking in trying to bring that research into something that was very practical and that was linking into the zoos research as well. So that was great. And then came across him when he was Head of Conservation Science at WWF UK, which was, and one of the things that Glyn was really championing at that point was proper organizational development for WWF offices around the world, particularly China and Brazil and Kenya. So those offices that instead of being offshoots of the global north, became their own offices and started to train up their own staff. And that was something that I thought was really important that Glyn championed, as well as really strong monitoring and evaluation. So I think he's a real force for conservation good. And I'm excited to hear about this topic. So go ahead.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. So I think I just stopped there. EJ's covered everything. And we go straight to the wine. Thank you, EJ, for your introduction. And thanks for all coming. I know it's the end of term. And this talk really is spanning a 40-year period. Let me just try and make sure that all this works. So I'm based at, well, I live near Canterbury. I have a honorary professorship at DICE, and I'm part-time with WWF Malaysia. And I spent the last 5 years in Sabah, North Borneo with WWF Malaysia, having started working for WWF Malaysia on the 1st of July, 1979. No deep in-breaths, thank you. So I had an opportunity, a unique opportunity, really to, having done surveys 40 years ago, to have a look more recently. And just wanted to share that with you now. So no modeling, sorry, data only, and some of it pretty basic and rudimentary in the sense of trying to understand what was in North Borneo, Sabah State 40 years ago, and how has it changed now. So that's the plan. And just to get the geography, because it is not simple, is this the easier one? So, oh, yes, does it come? Yeah, there we are. So Malaysia is a strange country in two parts with about 1,000 kilometers of sea between the two, which is why people get very confused about West Malaysia over here, Singapore at the bottom, and then East Malaysia over here, which actually covers a larger land area. Okay, so that's the Malaysia bit. Now the Borneo bit, right? Borneo is this island, and it comprises 3 countries, so it contains 3 countries, East Malaysia, Sabah here in the north, and Sarawak. Then Indonesia, Kalimantan here, about 3/4 of the island, and then tiny Brunei there. Okay, so it's 3 countries in Borneo. So I'm going to talk about Sabah, North Borneo up here. Before doing that, it's important to get the biogeographical context, in as much as during the last ice ages, say over the last 800,000 years, roughly every 100,000 years, the pale gray area was one landmass. So what is now Borneo, Sumatra, Java were all joined up together. It was also, this is during the glacials when the ice caps have got lots of ice, so the sea level drops, hence connecting all of this, but it's also drier. It's cooler and drier. So although they're connected, it's not ideal for rainforests. It's more savanna-like. But nonetheless, you can see, imagine the mixing of species, then isolation. Individual species can sort of go their own way, individual populations. So you get a huge diversity of species. So Sabah, out of all that mixing, separation, mixing, has got some rather intriguing and I think rather special things. So the Bornean elephant up here, which we'll talk about later. Where's this? There it is. 95% of Borneo's elephants, okay, that's the whole island, are only in Sabah, right? Not in the rest of Kalimantan. Welcome. This gray leaf monkey here, Sabah leaf monkey, is pretty much unique to Sabah. This white-crowned shama, the bird here, the rest of Borneo doesn't have the white crown. So you've got these just distinct populations, subspecies or species that make Sabah rather special. This is a subspecies of red leaf monkey, and the Prevost squirrel there is a subspecies also in Borneo, but unique to Sabah. So that's why it's a precious place, in my opinion. And 2 periods that we're going to look at. One is the Faunal Survey of Sabah. So young chap here goes off into the jungle, some fantastic field guides. And I work with a guy called John Payne, who's down here. Not a great Land Rover and terrible roads. We did 23 surveys across Sabah. I'll come into them in a bit, in a moment, and 12 sort of recce's looking at a particular part. But I'm going to focus on the 23 surveys. 5 years ago, I went back. All the WF team have marvelous logoed T-shirts and all look terribly smart. On the left there, fantastic vehicles, lots of them, very nice roads. Okay, so that's the 2 time intervals I'm talking about. And just to let you imagine, there's a bit of a change between the 2. So the first period, there's no internet. Gasp. There's no computers, there's no laptops, there's no mobile phones, there's no GPSs. Okay, yeah, how do we get around? We'll talk about that afterwards over wine. Then we come to the current period. So the survey method was basically a transect survey. The forest is very patchy, even unlogged forest. So trying to get a sense of what wildlife is there, which was our focus, larger mammals, basically. Cut a transect, marked it every 100 meters. You can see now there's a GPS. Can you see my cursor? Anyway, GPS here, and these are the markers. So every 100 meters, there's a marker. Set off at 6 in the morning, walk through the forest, take about 4 hours to do a 2-kilometer stretch, listening and trying to record everything. In the first time period, camera traps didn't exist. So they had a sort of box with a hinge and a little bit of stick and a string going across the path. hope that anything that walked past would fire off a camera inside the box, but it was covered in condensation. Okay, so no camera traps at that time. Lots now. So we put 3 camera traps at 1 kilometer. So intervals, so 0, 1 kilometer, and 3 kilometers, 9 camera traps. And it's just a very rapid assessment of wildlife that's there. In the most recent period, we did it for 3 days, making sure that there's no rain on any of those mornings. In the Faunal Survey period, we did it for 7 days. Okay, so not exactly the same methods, but a rapid assessment. Helicopters have also come in, and I'll describe how those were used for orangutan surveys when I get onto orangutans. So that's the sense of data gathering. Is it enough to inform policy rather than detailed assessment of species ecology and so forth? There are 2 books which reflect the results. So there they are. They're the 2 books. Okay, so you can flick through them at the end. This is extraordinary historic document written by hand, maps colored in with a rotring pen, and this is all digital. So, and one of the things that was driving me mad was because this wasn't digital, it didn't exist. So it's now all in here. So you can all rest assured it exists now. So the Wildlife Atlas of Sabah was also a multi-authored document, and most of the images I'm going to show are taken from that document. So there's lots of acknowledgements in that document, trying to make sure that Sabahans had an opportunity to write about their wildlife. And the main audience for it is civil servants, researchers, and people responsible for managing land in Sabah. So what's changed in 40 years? There you go. That's the change. The amount of data. So this is 1960. Can you see the cursor? It has that slight time lag. No, anyway, so 1960s, 60s to 1980, 1980 to 1999. So this is mostly, the yellow dots are mostly faunal survey records, that first period I talked about. And then this is a mass of data, especially around the Danam area, Dermacot area, Tabin, Sepilok a bit. So this is the more recent records. All of that has amounted to there's about 175,000 data points for Sabah. This is the change in the forest estate. So that is the forest reserves. And forest reserve includes both protection forest and commercial forest. Forests set aside for timber production. So 76, lots of forests in the eastern part of the state and the southern central part. And then in 1980, 85, you can see that the eastern side of the state is suddenly white. That's agriculture. In the southwest corner where it says Tawau, that was mostly cocoa. And Sabah was producing more cocoa than Ghana in the 70s and 80s. But that changed pretty quickly to oil palm plantations. So pretty much all of that white space you can see on the east and southern side is now oil palm monoculture and no longer forest estate. But as you can see, the forest estate has moved to the southwest. And I'll come back to this in a little bit more detail, but it also transferred from pale green, which is commercial forest for timber, to darker green, which is protection forest, after the timber had been taken out. So there's almost no primary forest in Sabah. Danam is about the only large block, and it's surrounded by log forest.
What was in the southwest before?
So it was forest, but it had been left for tribal lands, especially the Muruk tribe, who were vigorous in their defense of their lands and gave these colonial officers a bad time. So they said, right, well, we'll leave that. It is still the area from that time to now where there's probably most hunting going on. And on these eastern sides, unlike many other parts of Indonesia, for example, not Bornean, but elsewhere, very, very low human population density just along the rivers. But this clearance and the removal of forest reserves from the forest estate meant that there's fragmentation. You can see Tabin here, now isolated, having been connected. This is the Kinabatangan, which many people will have heard of. That was originally all connected to the central forest. It's now isolated in pockets. Tawau suddenly is isolated, having been connected. So there's a big fragmentation. These are quite big blocks still, 100,000 hectares, that sort of size. But that's the change that's gone on in terms of land use at the top level. So I want to concentrate on the primates, partly because that's my own academic interest in the past. Also somewhat because they don't really show up in camera traps. And there's been, in recent time, a focus on everything sort of above below 1.5 meters, because that's where the camera traps are set. And you've got a whole forest up there that's not really getting much of an airing. So I just wanted to bring those in. And so here's the orangutans, wonderful great ape, no tail, male with flanges, fully mature male, flanges on the side of the face. Here's a female. Now, generally speaking, females don't come to the ground. They stay up in the trees. They have a baby keep the baby with them for up to 5 years. So long maternal care. And then females tend to stay in the forest area near their mother. Males move away and in fact travel miles. So in the 70s, they're very hard to come across. They make a nest every night to go to sleep. And those nests, which you can see up there, are very useful measures of the presence of orangutans in a forest, because they are incredibly hard to see. Very quiet and just very smart at hiding. So hard to measure, and to be honest, we really only had an approximate idea that there were about 2 per square kilometer in the lowlands. When the logging started, they all disappeared. They are incredibly adaptable and they can travel large distances if they have to. So what we're trying to extrapolate from a quite unlogged forest and then trying to imagine what would happen after logging, and I think we got it pretty wrong. So just put my hand up there. So here's the map from the Faunal Survey. Concentration of the animals here, darker is higher population density estimate. And this was the sort of figures we used to come up with an estimate of a minimum of 4,000 orangutans in Sabah, but we really didn't know about the log forest and the highlands. So come on 40 years and a helicopter survey. So you've got 2 people in a helicopter flying about 70 meters above the forest, looking out, can see up to about 250 meters either side, and you count the nests onto a GPS. So each one of these little lines is actually a helicopter path, transect. And the colors, blue is no records, and going to darker, reddy brown. So pulling all that together, roughly, there were 25,000 orangutans in Sabah in 1980, roughly. There are now, better estimate, 11,000. And as you can see, where I showed you on the previous map, these are all the darkest population, that's gone. So roughly 10,000 have died for oil palm plantations and agriculture. Okay, so that's a 40-year change. 11,000 is still material. They matter, they are viable in the long term. And they're pretty much in this sort of Danam, Sigama, Durham-Macott area here and in Tabin. So about 1,200 orangutans here. Kinabatangan, they're sort of dotted through there. So the picture now is 80% of the population is here, 10% there, 7% in the Kinabatangan, and then some scattered ones around. So this log forest and managing that log forest is the key now. That's a protected area, it's logged. This Kinabatangan population, which is quite famous because a lot of tourism and so forth, is under pressure and has declined by 1/3 in 17 years. So about 1,200 to about 800. So still important, but the patches of forest in which they dwell and the separation of them really is denting the population. And the conservation approach now is, so how do we try and connect things through the oil palm ocean to join the islands of forest? Not simple, but that is for that circumstance here. But in these ones, actually, they're moving through log forest. It's a different story. So not just one story for orangutan conservation. I think that's a big message, because you only get little snippets of stories, and not to confuse them. There's two strategies according to where you are within the agricultural landscape. Gibbons. Gibbons are amazing. So incredibly long arms with these tendons that store energy and catapult them through the forest unimaginably quickly. They almost look like they're flying, like this one up here. They live in small family groups, monogamous, adult male, adult female, offspring, 2 or 3 offspring. And they, sorry, cute picture of them here showing they're clever. Can I get this to do what I was hoping? No. Yes, thank you. So they have strict territories, about 35, 40 hectares, which they mostly defend through singing. So every morning at dawn, this is how the forest begins. Okay. Thank you. Shall I stop that? So you can hear that up to 1 kilometer away. That's a female great call. And as I'm sure you all noticed, there's a little short one in between there, which is actually a daughter learning to do a great call from the mother. So the territories are set, pretty much set. And so you can take bearings, and as you move along the transect, note down which marker you're at, and then you can draw and triangulate where the call was given and map how many groups there are in roughly a 2 square kilometer survey quadrant. So that's how we've done the surveys of the gibbons. You know, they call every day, they're relatively abundant, so you can get a reasonable sample in a short time. So these were the results 40 years ago. Quite patchy, mostly commoner in the lowlands. And when we looked at the data above 500 meters, it drops off hugely. This is groups per square kilometer. Orangutans the same, but actually the lowlands even more important for them, which unfortunately is the best agricultural land as well. The rest is not so clear, but there's a big altitudinal effect. And this area here, to answer your question more fully, is more mountainous and hilly. So wildlife populations decline as you move southwest in the state. But looking now 40 years later, say in Tabin, which was logged, and the size of the circles are roughly the abundance. The color blue is more recently and yellow is the old ones. Actually, they're amazing and resilient, and they have recovered from actually dipping during the logging or after the intensive logging. And logging, just so you clear, I mean, the dipterocarp trees are fantastic, and they're not high quality furniture timber, but they're fantastic for plywood. So logging involved removing 50% of the trees, the basal area. Okay, so it really smashes it up. And when you're there watching it, you think, how can anything survive this? But they do. So that was a nice song of resilience from the gibbons over 40 years. So they are back, and no, you don't get them in the palm in that lowland agriculture, but in the heavily logged forest, they dipped and then they come back actually to the same levels we measured 40 years before. The leaf monkeys. So leaf monkeys, sacculated stomach like a cow, so fermentation, digestion. They don't chew the cud, but they ferment away. And, oh, sorry, jump on. Three species, one red and two gray. The grays, based on genetic analysis, got to Sabah in all that geological change of climate and habitat about 3 million years ago, and the reds got there about 1.5 million years ago. So for 1.5 million years, the grays had it to themselves, and then they had to put up with these reds coming in. They're the same body size. They basically have the same diets. They have the same social structure, adult male, 3 or 4 females, and offspring. So there's grounds for ecological competition. No one quite understands why. Some areas, the grays dominate, especially in Tabin and these highlands here. Other areas, the lowland areas, the reds dominate. Don't know why. So anyone looking for a PhD, sorting that out would be great. I think the main message on the logging story is they did not recover. Contrary to expectations, the gibbons and the orangutans are sort of frugivores, monogastrics like ourselves. And you thought, oh, well, they might have a harder time recovering after the logging when a lot of the fruit trees were smashed up. Whereas these, you think, okay, well, they're going to eat young leaves. There'll be more young leaves because everything's opened up after the logging. Sunlight's come in, but not. Don't know why. On theoretical grounds, you'd expect them to have recovered better than the gibbons. So there's an intriguing story there. I think I'll stop at that and move on to the others. There's a separate story for Sabah about the riverine coastal community. So you've got proboscis monkeys, silvered leaf monkey, and long-tailed macaques. And where they're together, you can see they follow the main big rivers, Sagama, Kinabatangan, and coastal areas. They seem to have stayed roughly the same until you clear those coastal strips or the riverine strips, and then there's no habitat for them. Not much lives in the oil palm monoculture, which is 1.6 million hectares. Okay, so that's the primate story. Just some other big issues, and I've picked some big species. So here's Tam, and this is the hairy rhinoceros, as John Payne has called them. So they went extinct in Malaysia in 2019. No more in Malaysia, and just little wisps of populations in East Kalimantan and Sumatra, Aceh. So I think the story there is they've been hunted for millennia for traditional medicine. probably up until the 60s, their populations were viable. But by then, the access along the logging roads meant they didn't really have anywhere to hide. So here are some of the locations in the past in the faunal survey time, the yellows. Once they get below a certain population, once they got below a certain population density, the females were not breeding sufficiently often and got uterine cysts, rendering them infertile. So there were sort of 15 to 30 was our estimate in 1980, by which time John reckons now they were already doomed because they just couldn't reproduce. And the females all became infertile very quickly. Very few records of young during that time, just older ones. So fundamentally, they are an example of empty forest syndrome. Hunting took them out. And once they got below a certain level, they couldn't keep themselves going anyway. I think the elephants, there has been no ivory attack in Sabah. One or two examples of trunks being taken. Thank God. The consequence of that is that the elephants, which are all concentrated in these lowlands, again, it's all in the lowlands here, that low alluvial forest, which is now gone. So if you look at the map now, the pale gray is where they used to roam, and the dark gray is where they are now recorded. So they're now squashed into forest patches, i.e. non-agriculture, but they will go out. They don't need trees. They don't climb trees. They are grass eaters, palm eaters, and so forth. So the population, we think, is roughly what it was 40 years ago, between 1,000 and 1,500. They're incredibly hard to count. And all the indirect methods of counting dung and then trying to convert it to have just failed. So we don't really know how many, but it's roughly 1,000 to 1,500. They are big, although lots of tourist brochures call them pygmy elephants. They're big. And they're therefore a problem with agriculture. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So palms they love. And oil palm, as the name suggests, is perfect when it's young for elephants to eat. So they're very unpopular then. But otherwise, as long as they get water and they can roam around, their population seems to have held on. But they're now getting squashed into smaller pockets. So monitoring those will be very important for the future. The banteng, studied by Penny Gardner and others, the X's really show where the population has changed since the Faunal Survey results and surveys in 2016, before the Atlas work began. And they really are, again, not dependent on forests per se. They feed in glades, along riverbanks, in old farmlands, but they need shade and they need the protection of the forest away from hunters. Maybe 300 to 400 left in Sabah, and they will be the next extinction unless we can look after them and probably set up some captive breeding. Pretty map, but it's I just enjoy it because we knew in 1980 there was just one species of barking deer or muntjac in Sabah. Then the taxonomists got organized and now there are two species. So and they are substantially different. So this is the red muntjac here, weighs sort of up to 28 kilos, and the Bornean yellow about 18 kilos. So big size difference. And the lowlands you can see is more yellow. So the Bornean one, more primitive species for various reasons. Lowland specialist doesn't like logging so much, but isn't wiped out by it. And the red muntjac, with subspecies going all the way to the Himalayas, happier in the highlands, over on this southwestern side, and happy with logging. But I don't think they're going to be wiped out, although they do taste great. Bearded pig. Bearded pig, there were millions and millions in Sabah. And then in the first COVID lockdown, 2020, African swine flu arrived from China, sorry. African swine flu arrived from China. So it just went through, and where you would commonly see wallows here, especially along old logging roads, this is what they look like 2 years later. Just no footprints, no wallows, nothing. Gone. Millions of bearded pig died. Disease came through, no resistance. There are little pockets that have survived. There are some records of piglets, but it's just a devastating reduction in the population. Just some mouse deer and some Ayau samba deer, just to give you a sense of the community on the ground, which I'm not going to go into details on. They're doing fine. They don't particularly like the oil palm monoculture, but they do fairly well in scrappy forest and so forth. But the pigs have changed massively. So that's the looking back. Now trying to look forward a little bit and think, so, okay, what are the conservation options that we have? The threats are hunting. So I've talked to you about the rhino. The banteng, frankly, is sport hunting and fun. People are not really starving or dependent on banteng for meat. So all these guys are sitting on the banteng there where they had a jolly night going out shooting. So some effort needs to be put into controlling that hunting, especially in protected areas. Bear paws, a traditional medicine. These are on sale in a market. This is a newspaper report of a guy being imprisoned for that, arrested and imprisoned. But just some interesting things as tourism from China increases in Sabah, same time zone. They're hoping to get 1 million tourists a year from China. COVID stopped it, but it was well on the way. So in the car park of the hotel, there are people trying to sell bear paws to Chinese tourists. So the market has come to Sabah. And how you get that information and warning to tourists is a fundamental requirement if they're going to not have the market pressure suddenly arrive. And as I say, ivory hasn't arrived in Sabah, and if it does, I think the elephant story will be a very different one. Pangolins, we just don't know about them. There must have been hundreds of thousands of them on the basis that so many have been taken, but there are still quite a few camera trap records of them. So PhDs there. You know, just it's an extraordinary species, traded globally, and there's some evidence that Sabah has been a trading hub with container loads of pangolin meat and scales being set aside to send to Vietnam. So that's hunting. And 1993 hunting survey, I just sort of emphasize here the bearded pig, the orange. So that was nearly half of the hunting in these 6 villages which were across Sabah in 93. This here is a picture of Wildlife Department arrests and confiscation of game. It's all in the plantation area. and 77% of it is bearded pigs before the African swine fever came through. So there's just an interesting switch from forest hunting to hunting in the plantations, bearded pigs, big crop pest, raiding from adjacent forest patches. Hunters going in at night, so providing urban centers with lots of pig meat. Those pigs have now largely gone. So the PhD, not that I'm selling PhDs, is what's happened now that there's no bearded pigs, considering it was 70%, 77% of that, and nearly half of that. So I suspect that the samba deer I showed you and the muntjac are taking the brunt of it. So I had to pop in a picture from Andrew Hearn because there's a chapter about clouded leopards in the atlas about, and also the data from for the muntjac is also from camera trap records from those studies. But basically, we started off with primary forest in the 60s. So you know it's primary forest because only 15% of the incident radiation that hits the top gets down to the forest floor. So there's no grass. So you know it's a primary forest because there's no grass. Okay, there you go, a little tip there. So there's lots of grass here popping up because guess what? There's no trees and they've all been cut down. So that was a huge, huge industry through the 60s. And for the 70s and 80s, Sabah produced more timber than the whole of Indonesia, which, as you recall from that earlier map, is a big area. So the timber was pouring out mostly to Japan at that time. But there's been substantial recovery of the species, as I've indicated. Then came the oil palm boom in the 80s up until, 2010s or so. So there's a picture of a beautiful mungaris tree standing sentinel over a oil palm monoculture. So that's what's been lost, if you can imagine the sort of measuring stick of that tree. It's an emergent tree, so most of the tree crowns would have come to about here. And these are all fully adult palms there. So the elephants love the young palms and they love the chipped palms. So after 25 years, the palms are cut down because their yield is declining. And Sabah's been very good about not burning. So the rule is you're not allowed to burn as part of agricultural clearance. So they have to chip the trunks. It's like the dinner bell. And they can hear the chipper machine. And then they come. So in Tabin, they had 120 elephants come out for dinner when the chipper machine started. So, you know, they're big. And managing that relationship between elephants and oil palm is really about sustainable palm oil production and how to do that well. So what happens? You clear the ground, clear the land, clear the forest to the soil. Okay, then you plant the trees and you have, you know, here are the trees coming up all in straight lines. Here you have a wonderful Bornean ironwood stump, too hard for them to dig out. A little headstone and another one for a once mighty forest that was standing there. Okay. Especially in Indonesia, but as I've said, not particularly in Sabah, you have burning to clear the trash and huge haze problems, Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, and so forth during the dry season. And you have workers to crop the palm oil. Here you go, here's a nice palm oil fruit there. They load it all onto the back of a trailer, it's carried off and it goes to a mill. And there's a whole debate about certification. MSPO is Malaysian certified palm oil and RSPO is Internationally Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil certified. But they have cleared the forest to the, and where certification of timber, FSC, or marine, seafood, MSC, philosophically is trying to maintain the habitat. When you clear it for agriculture, what are you certifying? You've cleared the habitat. You saw the picture. A lot of people confuse that. It's a big change in certification to go from capture or timber extraction, where you take a commodity, but you keep the habitat, to clearing it, and aquaculture the same. So the certification, especially RSPO, which is international standard, is about labor standards, fair living wage, no slave labor, no child labor. It's about chemicals, fertilizer, pesticide use, and good agricultural practices. It's about managing water within a plantation, having riparian boundaries to stop runoff and so forth. But it's not really about wildlife. And nor should it be expected to be. So you will hear buy RSPO certified palm oil and save orangutans. It is not reasonable to expect that. So I'll come back to that in a minute, but I just want to make that fundamental point. Looking to the future again, climate change is coming. There's a hell of a lot of rain, 3-4 meters a year, 2.5 to 3.5 per year. Already substantial flooding, particularly because upper catchments have been cleared and or logged, and so their water retention capacity has been reduced. But typhoons and so forth, and intensity of storms increasing. Here are some forest fires that happened in log forest, but not recently. With 2 years of El Nino expected now, I wonder whether forest fires will become a risk again. It's not clear. And I don't have any pearls to offer on that. So, looking at Sabah then, what interventions are there, and what are we hoping for in terms of conservation? I think there are two important areas. First is on forest cover. So Malaysia is committed to 50% forest cover under the CBD, and they pretty much held that, and Sabah actually does have about 50% forest cover. Log forest, not primary forest, but it's still forest. Sabah has gone one more. So that's federal, that's East and West Malaysia. That's a federal commitment. Sabah's gone one more and said we'd like 30% totally protected area for the state within that 50. 30%, and they're currently at 26%. So that is fantastic. And it may be 30% by the end of this year or next year. Then on the palm, which is their biggest export, and they were 5 years ago, they were providing 10% of world palm oil production. So a huge contributor for a small state. It is now mandatory, a regulation, that all growers must satisfy MSPO, that is Malaysian Sustainable Palm Oil Standards. These have improved tremendously, but are well below what you would expect in terms of labor and in terms of wildlife or biodiversity. So WWF's narrative is, of course, we support any standard for palm oil improvement, and this is an essential step towards RSPO. So it's not a bad thing, even though it's not quite up to standard, but it's a necessary step to get up there. Sabah has gone one more, so that's federal MSPO requirement regulation. Sabah says they'd like to be 100% RSPO by 2025. So on both measures of certified palm oil and area under forest, Sabah's set a policy framework target to be one better than that. So that's fantastically encouraging. Looking at the, it doesn't come up very nicely. But anyway, you can sort of see the colors. So the orange, the dark green, and the blue are protected areas, and actually the red as well. And that's 26%. The pale green is logged forest, and some is still being logged, so it's production forest. The challenge is it's pretty much exhausted, and it's a long wait before there'll be a decent yield off those heavily logged forests. So where will Sabah's timber come from? And it's going to be plantations, industrial plantations. And where will they go? Don't know. So how can you try and put all this together? If palm oil production, sustainable palm oil production, can't really be expected to deliver on wildlife, how do you have a narrative that brings the palm together with the forest, with the wildlife? How do you do that? So it's really landscapes. It's a landscape where you combine three things. Protection. So this is Tawau. You may recall it was in that southeastern corner of Sabah. Isolated block. You've got Tower Hills Park, Ulu Kalumpang, these dark areas here. So that is protection forest and has been for a long time. And WWF Malaysia, for whom I work part-time only, I'm not a staff member, monitors that every year for deforestation. So you got deforestation in a landscape of the area that's been set aside, in some cases for 40 years. Then around here, this is all agriculture, pretty much all oil palm plantations. And how can we get that all to go from uncertified to MSPO certified to RSPO certified? And that's being monitored every year. And finally, there's a little blue corridor. So that's within a plantation. So it's a question of engaging with the plantations and saying, this forest block is disconnected from those central forests. Please, can we make a corridor? So that is a 14-kilometer corridor. It's about 1,100 hectares, between 400 and 800 meters wide, according to the planting squares within the plantation. It's a tree plantation with oil palm. And actually it was set up because they had a problem with elephants. And they put a fence to try and stop the elephants. The elephants do a sort of loop every year. Hit the fence, bounced off it, stressed out, starting to knock down palms, houses, water towers, all in the Sabah softwoods plantation. So 5 years ago, no, more, 10 years ago, Cheryl and others in the elephant team said, just open the fence and make it a corridor. So the losses went from 500,000 Malaysian ringgits a year to 5,000 a year, just by opening it up. That was the losses. So yeah, they lost land. They forewent land that could have been productive, but workers not being chased by elephants, not having their houses bashed, not having that damage, win-win. So looking for those kind of, how can you get the industry, the agricultural land to offer up corridors is a key part of what the future holds for Sabah. And that's a nice example of where it's worked. And then finally, how will the market, all the people worried about orangutans and oil palm, you know, obviously, palm oil is in 50% of all foods in UK supermarkets. We've all used it today when we brushed our teeth. If you shampooed, you've also used it, etc. You know, it's there. So the market's saying, look, how can we invest in landscapes where protection, production and restoration, the corridors, are integrated. So we spent time going through with a Malaysian consultant all Sabah's environment, water, soil laws. We then looked for metrics that were asked for in those laws. And then we tried to find those where there was enough information. So that was quite salutary. It wasn't our research, it was what were the government statistics that we could access, that they were prepared to share, that we could do by landscape. So this is the picture I've just shown you is the Tau landscape. It's still work in progress, but it gives you a little bit of a sense of, okay, so deforestation or changes in total protected area for a landscape. There's no right answer. You can't say, well, a landscape this big should have this much forest. But you can say, have you maintained it? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? And you can show that annually over time. So that's one of the tools we're trying to develop so that everybody can say, right, there's something wrong here. Can we work on that? And or the market and say, yeah, no, we'd like to invest here. We'd like to support sustainable production of oil palm and or restoration, which is what Unilever and Nivea cream are doing at the minute. Thank you. You've been fantastic for a Friday afternoon in a hot, sticky room. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, I see the glint of youth in many people's eyes. I'll ignore the front row. And have fun, but do get involved and sort it out, because it's continuous relay race for conservation. Thank you very much.
So does this work? Is that you're going to pass it around? Is that the idea?
That's for the online audience, yeah.
Okay, so I'm looking for hands on the online audience. And is anyone in person got a question? Oh, well, there's 3 questions around here, so you can just pass between them.
Thank you. It's a fascinating story about the animals of Sabah. I'm from Kalimantan. I was wondering more, it would be like hear the story about how conservation has evolved. I mean, from 4 decades ago to today in promoting community participation in conservation, and how actually the government attitude has changed over the years on the effort. Thank you.
Okay. So that's another talk, and you probably had enough. But as I said at the beginning, Sabah is very unusual in having a very low human population density on that eastern side. Very low. Most of Sabah's population was on the western side, Kadazan, Murut, and so forth, and a rice culture, especially terraced rice. As a consequence, and I'll just give you an example, the labor in Sabah on the plantations is possibly, well, it's not registered, but it's roughly between 500,000 and 1 million, many from Indonesia. Okay, so it gives an example of the low human population density that was there, and that for labor, they've come in from a bit from the Philippines, but mostly from Indonesia.
And they are Japanese.
No, they're well, okay. So they're range, actually. They come from Kalimantan. They've come from Sulawesi. Many Bugis people there. Not Java particularly. Some, but not so much. So within the forestry estate, there are some community forests, not a lot, more focused on the southwest and the west, where the higher population of indigenous people were. There is increasing effort to look more at community engagement in forest management as human population's gone up and pressure on the forest has increased. But the bulk of the land there, the pale green and dark green I showed you, around here, has very, very low human population density.
How low is it compared to the
Well, compared to
The North
Kalimantan.
Kalimantan,
Okay.
yes.
I don't know. I don't have those figures.
Because North Kalimantan, that's correct.
Okay. so-
Yeah, but East Kalimantan is quite low as well,
Mm.
even down here. So it's early days, and partly because just different history of logging. It's been mostly industrial and industrial agriculture.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, Glyn and David, and then we've got something like.
Yeah.
Thank you. Really impressive story, the whole thing. I was really interested in your observations of how logging affected the different species and wildlife. We had a paper out a few months ago where for the Safe study site.
Yes.
We found evidence that logging seemed to improve the population of many old growth forest species of birds and mammals because of the more palatable food and more available
Right.
habitat and
Yeah.
things. I was wondering, given your experience and observations, what's your take on that observation, and what do you think?
Okay, so first thing is, log forest is not one thing. Okay, so the extraction rate and the history since felling are all very different. One. Two, the density of the family Dipterocarpaceae, the main timber trees, is unbelievably high in Sabah, in Borneo, much higher than in say West Malaysia or Sumatra. And they're mostly unpalatable. For herbivores. They're huge, they're straight, they're full of terpenoids, the dama, and almost nothing feeds on them except bearded pigs when you have a mass fruiting and they all come and eat the dipterocarp fruits. So taking out non-food, with the exclusion of the poor old bearded pigs that have been hit by something else, I think was one of the big lessons from 40 years ago to now, that actually you could improve it. That said, for the species I've looked at, and I've of course read the paper, it didn't measure what things were or were not eating. It estimated based on their ecological probabilities. So I'm just saying what I measured, and it's only a small number of the many species in that paper. So I think we need to measure it. The columbine monkeys, for me, which I really expected to respond in the way that your paper described, didn't. They just didn't. And then when I look through the papers, I can't see anything about them. So, you know, it needs unpacking. Because they should be a generous herbivore, they should do fine with all the new growth. But a lot of that new growth is not palatable. So you've got alkaloids to deal with. This could take a long time. Anyway, I'll leave it at that for now. But so what do I think? I think it's quite possible, but we don't know. And the bits that I wanted to measure, I was amazed that the gibbons, largely frugivores and fig dependent, have all recovered, but after a long time. If we looked at it after 10 years, I'd have had a different story. 20 years now, it's amazing. So I think that, yeah, there's a lot going on.
Lynn, thank you very much. Two sort of linked questions about Cheryl's hole in the fence. One is, do you know what thought processes and evidence led to the positioning of the hole, which clearly worked out very well? And more interestingly, tell us a bit more, if you would, about that corridor. Physically, what is it? How wide is it? Is it a regulatory thing or a biological thing?
Okay, so it's all within an oil park. It's all within a Sabah softwoods plantation. So it's owned and managed by the plantation. The plantation is a subsidiary of Yayasan Sabah, but it's managed as a plantation. Mostly tree plantation, eucalyptus, acacia. It's the third one. Anyway, eucalyptus and acacia, the common ones. What is the other one? Albizia. Thank you. Albizia. Thank you. So big blocks, monoculture blocks. They have oil palm dotted around on the better soil. there's a stream that runs sort of north-south somewhat, and a ridge. And so that was the ecological corridor that was identified. According to their planting blocks, a block is 400 meters. So sometimes it's 1 or sometimes it's 2. So it's between 400 meters and 800 meters wide. It's 14 kilometers long. And there's bits of riparian forest accessible along it, but there's also blocks of plantations, a bit like in the photograph of the orangutan, the female orangutan walking through felled eucalyptus. So that's the management. They have fences either side. They have people tracking it. Cheryl's satellite collar data is showed, I think it's every 4 hours, there's a readout with the plantation management. And they have a whole lot of protocols about whistle blowing and blowing whistles and moving people out of areas where the elephants are coming. So a lot of effort has gone into that. It doesn't particularly help forest dependent species, say gibbons. They need trees all the way through. So we're now adding to that corridor on what's its original purpose, tree planting. Initially in sort of little islands, it's very expensive and survivorship is very low. So everybody here, if anyone says we planted 1 million trees, ask them how many survived. Okay, just ask them. You have to maintain for 5 years. Cut around it, clear the weeds which are growing over it all the time. Before the trees you planted are big enough to survive. So lots of corporate, we planted 1 million trees. Sorry, how many survive? There's like 80% mortality commonly, unless you do the maintenance. So that's what's going on that corridor. Is that okay?
Okay, so we've got someone online. We've got Nick Wilcox. Do you want to just ask your question? Unmute.
Can you see? I'm not sure.
I wondered if you see any effects of climate change on the altitude that different species prefer to live at.
So thank you. No, and a really important question, which is why I just popped a slide in there, which is sort of hands up, we don't know. So they've got some nice data from Mount Kinabalu, which is 4,000 meters altitude, showing moths going upwards. They've got a mixture of results from bird surveys, again on Mount Kinabalu. Some have gone up, some have stayed where they are, and some actually appear to have come down. So I think it's, we're not clear what the impacts are going to be. We just know something's going to happen. So again, back to this connectivity and trying to make sure there's corridors to allow migration from areas that become less suitable for species X to areas where they may prefer, but we're really not clear what they are or how it's going to pan out. It's just not clear. So no, don't know. I mean, there's some preliminary results from Sabah, but not really. Of course, risk of flooding is easier to monitor, and a lot of the southeastern area, so the northeastern part of Tabin, is likely to be flooded. It's 5-10 meters above sea level at the minute.
Thank you.
Okay, so there's just time for one more question. Yeah. Oh God, we've got 2. All right, 1, 2, quick ones, and Glyn will answer quickly as well. Yeah, at the back.
Sorry, yes, we've gone on. Blimey. We started late.
Well, I'm Vinod Mathur from India.
Hello.
Vinod Mathur from India. Very interesting presentation. See the oil palm plantations and the certification that you talked about is now going to expand in a big way, not only in the Southeast Asia, but in other parts.
Yes, yeah.
Now, you also mentioned about Malaysia's likely achievement of the 30 by 30 target.
Sabah state. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
So my question then is that what, according to you, could be additional safeguards in certification so that once we have the oil palm plantations, we also are doing a bit of conservation as well.
Okay,
Thank you.
so thank you. So I think you've got to the exact limitation of agricultural certification, is that, you know, it helps with labor standards very much. Communities, there are good indicators, principles, criteria, and indicators for the social side. Chemicals and chemical use is good. Wildlife, not really, because you've cleared the habitat. So that's where you have to go to landscape. And no one can face another certification for landscapes. But how can we pull together that table I showed? What kind of measures can we use that are useful, that everyone is happy to share? There's lots of secrecy, and that are and the data are accurate. I can't remember, it's at the end. It's that one, the 33. Yeah, thank you. So that's the space that needs to be developed, but it needs to be developed there. I mean, there are some land scale, for example, is a very well thought through, widely discussed set of indicators. Actually, probably too many. So one of the dangers is you end up with so many indicators, you sink it. No one can keep it in their heads. It's too much. The flip, so we said, no, we'll only take it from Sabah's existing policy documents. It will belong to Sabah. The flip of that is you're missing lots of data. And, you know, so number of corruption complaints, for example. So very few, okay. But actually, if I complain in Kota Kinabalu, my complaint is registered there, even if I'm complaining about something that happened in Tower. So you suddenly have real limits on you know, what data are useful. So I've confirmed that it's a very difficult problem. Yes, I think we can take units. So okay, certification means this, and then so what about deforestation? Yes, we can monitor that, but not in the plantation. So then, how do you have a landscape measure that we're all okay with, and that government's okay with? Not just, yeah. Sorry.
Thank you very much for the super talk. I was just wondering, obviously you focused on Sabah today, and it's been an amazing talk. And it's good to see animals like orangutans having viable populations. But obviously there's the other state, Sarawak, and then also Kalimantan as well. So I was wondering, could you talk a bit more about maybe the wider Bornean landscape of conservation and any transboundary, any goings on?
So so in 30 seconds, no. So there's a very impressive Heart of Borneo initiative, which has kind of lost a bit of steam at the minute, but I think will come back, which does look at the connectivity of protected areas between those neighboring states. It's all on the website and so forth. And so keeping that political process going does allow more constructive work underneath it on the ground. Once the governments have agreed to work together. Okay, 1. 2, I have not gathered the data such as I've given here for Sabah, for Kalimantan or Brunei or Sarawak. As I've said, 95% of Sabah's elephants, Borneo's elephants, are in Sabah. There's probably one other population in the 11,000 for the orangutans in Kalimantan, that sort of scale down in the south. So no, I'm not going to generalize. It is real patchy and it's not homogeneous at all. So making generalizations is very tricky.
Okay, so just to finish off, no, there's going to be wine. There's going to be wine. So just to finish off, you know, Glyn gave us a selection of potential talk titles, and I chose this one because I think it's really important that we take the long view when we think about conservation and sustainability in general. And Glyn has this enormous expertise that enables him to take the long view like this. And I just want you to end up by saying, taking the long view, how positive are you feeling? Are you an optimist?
Yeah, so I'm an optimist, so that's just annoying for everyone else. But actually, the figures I've given you, yeah, I mean, the Sumatran rhino's gone, and that was tragic. I did not expect, well, Sabah has enough of all of those species pretty much to be viable in perpetuity. And I didn't expect that would be the case when so much of it was so intensively logged. Agriculture, we know, is a problem, but most of the good soil has gone. If they want to expand, they're going into rocky, hilly areas. So I think there's a general feeling of, even amongst the most sort of gung-ho agriculturists, actually, it's not smart to do that. So I am very optimistic. What we need is young leaders to keep it going. And I would say leadership, thought leadership, and team leadership, government leadership, that is what we need. I've just reflected that here. I haven't really talked about it, but yeah.
So on that note, we've got some wine, and let's just thank Glyn again for a really inspiring talk.
Thank you.
And thanks to the people who came online. Sorry about the wine, but I hope you enjoyed the talk.
Ooh, do we want to open a window?